So welcome to the American Institute for Philosophical and Cultural Thought. I'm Randy Oxher. I'm the Vice President and Secretary of this. My co-director, Larry Hickman, is also here. The President of the Institute, John Shook, is off in Maryland teaching, but will be here again in the summer when we have your, can you say countryman? Your country person? Will be here for the summer. Our summer dissertation fellow will be living here from June 1st through August 1st, and her name is Gioia Laura Iannelli from the University of Bologna. And she's going to be doing a dissertation research here on Dewey's aesthetics, which this is a good place to do that. And so we're looking forward to that. We have another program next week. Diana Prokofieva is going to get us a paper on Erich Fromm and Eastern Orthodoxy. It's going to be very interesting, I'm sure. And then on Friday, April the 12th, we have a musical program about, Dana and Susan Robinson have a new project. They live in Vermont, but we're in North Carolina for like 20 years before that, but they have a new musical project, a CD, on a town in Vermont that music saved. And so it will be a bit of Americana music here. And that's on the evening of the 12th, which is a Friday night. That'll start at 7 o'clock as well. So that's what's coming up here at the AIPCT. Many of you have been here before, but since a few of you have not, this is a not-for-profit 501c federal private foundation dedicated to research and education, and you're here to get the second of those this evening. Research is something that you can arrange to do here, and this is also the last week for this year's resident fellow, David Beiseker, who has been here on and off, mostly on, since September. Yeah, and so it's been a long time, but he's leaving this Wednesday, and so, but you said you'll come back in the summer at some point, so that'll be good. So what we do here is we do host resident researchers, and we host these programs, and we are supported by donations. And so if you're feeling generous, not necessarily tonight, but you can always go to the donate button on our webpage and help us out. However, I have to say we're doing quite well because people have been generous, and it doesn't actually take all that much in the way of money to run these programs and to keep this collection growing and being cataloged. So that's the AIPCT. I'm now going to turn this over to my colleague and friend Ken Stickers, who is going to introduce tonight's speaker.
I'm delighted to introduce our speaker tonight, Professor Roberta Dreon from Foscari University in Venice, Italy. We've been collaborating for several years now, mainly in the area of American philosophy, but also in philosophy of economics. Professor Dreon, you were really trained in continental philosophy, phenomenology originally, and had a Heidegger period, but then you saw the light, right, and discovered Pragmatism, and especially John Dewey, and has been working extensively on Dewey's aesthetics in particular. She is a visiting scholar at the archives, the Dewey archives at SIU, and is particularly now you're trying to find out more about Dewey's reading of Hegel's aesthetics. So if anybody knows anything about that, apparently he taught a course on Hegel's aesthetics, but the lecture notes do not seem to be part of the archives. So if anybody has done any research in that area, you'd be happy to speak with them.
Yes, of course.
So I'll turn things over to Professor Dreon. Topic, looking at human sensibility by pragmatist means in search for a rounded portrait.
So thank you very much, Ken. Thank you for your hugely generous hospitality. And thank you, Larry Hickman. Many thanks to Randy Oxher for having me here in this prestigious institute. And thank you very much to all of you for being here. I hope not to be too boring this evening. So I will read my paper, but before reading my paper, I would like giving you some information about the general background out of which this paper arises. That is, since some years I have been working mainly on three different subjects that are interconnected, but also relatively independent. The first subject is constituted by the conception of sensibility, emotions, feelings in the pragmatist tradition. In the last months, I have been working also in a kind of engagement between pragmatists, observation on this kind of subjects, and the current debate in let's say progressive neurosciences. That is, those neurosciences that are supporting an idea of the mind as radically embedded, extended, and embodied. A second focus of mine has been on the concept of habit, particularly with reference to Dewey's Human Nature and Conduct, but also with reference to James's treatment of habit. And I have found many interesting points of convergences and of divergences between Dewey and, in particular, and Bourdieu's conception of habits. A third chapter of my research is focused on what I'm going to characterize as unlanguaged experience. That is, an idea of linguistic practices as continuous with experience. I think that we should try to go beyond the traditional divide that between supporters of language and supporters of experience that have been troubled the two main trend in pragmatism. I mean the classical pragmatists, and on the one hand, and on the other hand, the so-called neo-pragmatists. I think that a dichotomy between language and experience is wrong, has to be solved, and I think that in the pragmatists, particularly in Dewey and in mid positions, we can find instruments, tools to go beyond this kind of apparent dichotomy. So while dealing with all of this stuff, I progressively realized that they were converging into a certain idea of human nature. That is, I think that we still need to speak about human nature from a philosophical point of view, although considering human nature as something completely contingent, fortuitous, but irreversible. And so this is the main. This could be a main sketch of the work I'm working on at the moment, and the paper I'm going to present you this evening is a part of a first chapter. It is a very shortened version, and it is a very provisional version. So I will be very grateful to all of you for comments, hints, advices, because this is a work in progress, and I asked Ken to be here in order to engage with the subject I'm dealing with, and to check if they are if the development I'm trying to pursue is a good one, if it works, and so on and so forth. So thank you very much indeed again. I begin. So to begin with, let us consider the very common experience of entering a crowded train coach for commuting to work. Except for philosophers and neuroscientists that have been trained to deal with these kinds of situations from a strictly intellectual point of view, it would sound odd characterizing this experience as a mere registration of sensory data to be processed whether on a mental or a neurological level in order to build an internal representation of the external state of things by means of a mirror reflection or eventually even through a more aseptic computational encoding process. Differently, when entering a wagon, I will be looking for a seat to sit in, or at least for a portion of space where I can stand up, avoiding as much as possible keeping in physical contact with other people I perceive as almost obstructing my personal space. I will probably be disturbed by the noise of voices speaking loud at their phone, annoyed by a person laying her backpack on the floor and usurping the space in front of my legs, disgusted by a smell of fried chicken emanating from my neighbor's clothes, amused by the little kid looking curiously at me from the seat behind. Can we simply throw all of this stuff out of the window of philosophical concern by confining it within the realm of the mere subjective or the first person's perspective as opposed to a third, more objective approach? I honestly think that this is a philosophical shortcut we should try to avoid. My feeling disgust, disturbed, annoyed, or amused by other people's behaviors have to do with material constraints, for example, a limited amount of space, as well as with the real actions of other people on me, talking too loud or fidgeting continuously. My contention is that the conceptual opposition between subjective and objective qualities, as well as between private and public experience, seems to be a net with two large links, unable to capture the complexity of our interactions with the world. This was an issue, I think, that James was trying to disentangle in the essay in Radical Empiricism, and that Dewey was finally able to dismantle in his experience and nature and in art as experience. Both of them were interested in recovering the kind of mongrel but mostly effective functionality of ordinary sensibility, apart from the typically epistemological glasses through which sensibility had been traditionally considered. Authors such as Herbert Marcuse and Helmut Plessner independently claimed against the preeminent habit to consider sensibility almost exclusively as sensory perception, whose eminent function is expected to be a cognitive one. Obviously, no one could deny that sensory perception does play a crucial role in our knowledge of reality. However, epistemic perception is only a part of a more complex and multifaceted commerce with the world I would like to retrieve. I'm not referring here to a rather obscure, almost phantom conception of sensibility as an ineffable phenomenon, as, for example, Schopenhauer did. On the contrary, I am interested in claiming philosophical attention for our sensibility as it unfolds in the wild, namely as it characterizes a human animal living in its everyday environment. From a methodological point of view, my intention is not to indulge in emphatic, impressionistic interpretations of ordinary sensibility. On the contrary, I think we should try to give a clear, although non-dogmatic, image of ordinary sensibility in its qualitative, affective, or aesthetic thickness. That is, an image that should be as clear as it can at this moment. If we adopt a pragmatic, non-metaphysical conception of clarity, honestly conscious of its derived and limited role, as well as of its provisional and always reviewable value, I see no reasons to renounce to an analytical attitude in philosophy and to the contextual utility of discrimination. I think that the classical pragmatists, particularly Dewey, but also James and Mead, give us some tools to develop such a line of thought, tools that have not yet been overcome by inactive and fully embodied approaches to the human mind, cognition and affectivity, although they seem to be more and more convergent with them. The classical pragmatists adopted a basic anti-intellectualistic attention for human ordinary practices, interactions and experience, although not renouncing to formulate a tentative, pluralistic, but still theoretical hypothesis to interpret them. The case is evidently different, for example, with the late Wittgenstein. Consequently, I will adopt a sort of mixed methodological stance, trying to develop an explicit and somewhat radicalized interpretation of ordinary sensibility out of a functional reconstruction of the works of Dewey, James, and Mead, through constant engagement with insightful voices of current debates on this issue. So I will try to begin my discourse by searching for a provisional, operational definition of sensibility. So in this paper, I will have no time to recover Dewey's extended criticism of an eminently epistemic idea of perception, as it can be found in many of his works. Very synthetically, he basically worked in order to reframe sensory perception within a cognitive context that does not exhaust the complexity of experiences we, as living beings, do of and in our environment. For sure, Dewey did not underestimate the importance of sensory data within cognitive activities. His contention is differently that sensory data should be assumed as the result of processes of inquiry, results that have been isolated, selected, and taken because of specific hypotheses working as guide of our inquiries. Therefore, it would be illegitimate considering them as the first merely descriptive recording of external reality, while it is usually beneficial to use them within context of inquiry. This argument has to do with Dewey's distinction between primary experience and reflective experience or inquiry, that, I suggest, could be probably considered as a radicalization of James's first distinction between knowledge by acquaintance and knowledge about. James's distinction is not at all equal to Russell's discrimination between knowledge by acquaintance and knowledge by description, because James's distinction is neither primarily epistemic nor foundational to me. Nonetheless, I prefer to skip this part in order to suggest the pars construens of my discourse on sensibility. So, in art as experience, Dewey recommended a shift of field from an ontology of art tailored on the way we experiment works of art in a museum to the field of basic biological assumption about experience and life. By following Dewey, I think a similar change of approach should take place with reference to human sensibility. We should shift our focus from a conception of sensibility tailored on its possible foundational role in a representative view of cognition to sensibility as a structural dimension of animal life and of human life more specifically. This could be a good key to approach this issue, although Dewey did not show favor for the word sensibility, preferring to speak about experience in general and primary or immediate experience to refer to the qualitative or aesthetic dimension of human interactions with a natural and natural cultural world. Let's give a look at the biological commonplaces Dewey invites us to consider in order to understand what art is and what role it has or could have in our practices. He said that we should focus on the essential condition of life, out of which artistic practices arise. Namely, we should take into account that life must unfold in an environment with which an organism cannot but interact in order to survive. Its life cannot be limited to the organism's skin because it structurally depends on the environment to which the living being must continuously accommodate. The environment both exposes the living being to dangers and gives it chances to find resources for living and flourishing. For this reason, life consists in a succession of phases, rhythmically alternating moments when the living organism falls into steps with its environment, and phases when the dynamic equilibrium breaks and the organism has to act in order to recover unison. To this conclusion, Dewey adds an interesting remark, namely that new forms of mutual accommodation allow no simple return to the previous state, because the current point of arrival, I quote, is enriched by the state of disparity and resistance through which it has successfully passed. End of quote. This is a remark, I think, favoring a dialectic reading of the organic environmental process of interaction. The above-mentioned biological commonplaces constitute also the main assumptions for a pragmatist understanding of sensibility, from which a sort of provisional definition of human sensibility can be derived. For the moment, I suggest deriving a very provisional definition of sensibility through the above-mentioned shift of field from an epistemological framework where the main relationship is between cognition and sensibility to a broadly speaking biological stance where sensibility is seen from the perspective of life and organisms' dependence from their environment. If we approach sensibility as rooted in life and in its environmental conditions, we can see that sensibility means basically, for a living organism, being selectively exposed to the environment, namely both to dangers and to opportunities to grow, move, act, improve, as well as to suffer and die, to resistance and menaces as well as affordances, if we adopt that famous expression from Gibson's ecological approach. Moreover, in the case of the human being, we must consider that the human environment is not simply natural, but also naturally cultural. Namely, it is also made of shared practices that are laden with deep-seated meanings, habits, rules, etc. This means that human sensibility cannot be conceived as merely anchored in biological needs. Differently, our biological propensities to feel and select are always already modified and reconfigured by our cultural practices. Dewey did not use the word sensibility to characterize this eminently qualitative, aesthetic, or affective dimension of a human being's interaction with the world. Nonetheless, I favor this linguistic choice because of a series of reasons. The first one is because of the ambivalence of the word that has been traditionally used in many languages, both to make reference to experience through the senses and to characterize an affective engagement with the world, capable of discriminations based on feelings, desires, longings, and refusals, as frequently pointed out by James. This double meaning can represent a positive feature, I think, because sensibility may convey the idea that our fully embodied experience of the environment is primarily affective, qualitative, or aesthetic. To be affected by something or someone, to remember the traditional emphasis of the verb affizieren in classical German philosophy, does not primarily mean to register purely descriptive sense data that are expected to be elaborated later, whether by the intellect or by a computing brain, and more recently in order to be processed through predictive coding. On the contrary, it means feeling or having something as important to one's own life as dangerous, annoying, disturbing, or joyful. Dewey uses the verb have or feel in contrast to know. Radical embodiment means, from such a point of view, considering the senses and the whole body in their basic connection with life and its structural dependence from an environment, rather than as a means to collect information for representing an alleged merely external reality. We humans are sensible beings as other animals and in continuity with them, but we are also quantitatively, that is, more than other animals, because our form of life is structurally more exposed to the environment we belong to. We are peculiarly immature and vulnerable at birth than other mammals. Our ways of behavior are largely indeterminate and plastic. We have no specific environmental niche, and we are able to attune our lives to the most different material conditions. We are also differently sensible beings from a qualitative point of view, I argue, at least at the moment, that is because of the complete fortuitous course our form of life has taken until now. This is because the natural environment we are constitutively exposed to is socially and culturally shared before our birth and is continuously reshaped by our doings and undergoings in it. Dewey's Human Nature and Conduct, as well as Mead's essays dating back to the first decade of the 20th century, frequently emphasize this point, probably thanks to their reading Fiske's and Chauncey Wright's texts, a point that had been later characterized in terms of neoteny by evolutionary biology. Sensibility, consequently, could be explicitly connected with the notion of constitutive dynamic coupling, a concept suggested by Gallagher and Kirchhoff in 2017. The dependence of the entire organism, brain and body included, from its own environment, and conversely, is both causal and constitutive, or even better, we cannot clearly distinguish, excerpt from specific cases and for specific purposes, between causal and constitutive relations because all kinds of resources, neurological, organic, environmental, interact on different diachronic levels to allow both the self-individuation of the human organism as well as the continuous rearrangement of our natural and naturally cultural environment. Thomas Alexander has clearly stated that the distinction between an organism and its environment should be considered as taking place dynamically and mutually. On the one hand, his life depends on resources and energies of the environment. On the other hand, the organism is an integral factor of an already existing but still in theory environment that is continuously reshaped to a larger or lesser extent by means of organic actions and behavior. Consequently, if we want to make a comparison with enactivist categories, there is a major emphasis from the point of view of the pragmatists on the precariousness of organic life, whose structural exposure to an uncertain environment represents the roots of human sensibility. Uncertainty will consequently be radically reinterpreted in affective rather than mainly epistemological terms as anchored in the natural condition of precariousness characterizing an organism's life that has always to strive to maintain and flourish because there are no guarantees from the environment that it will last forever. This is a second reason for favoring the return of the word sensibility, allowing us to stress that our engagement with the world happens on the background of this feeling of precariousness and exposition, rooted in our natural dependence from extra-organic resources, social and cultural factors included. The other side of the coin is that emphasizing the anchorage of sensibility in the natural and naturally cultural conditions of human life allows us to restate a non-dogmatic realism as a peculiar feature of classical pragmatism, that is, a form of realism immune to the metaphysical claim that reality is out there, completely and definitely equipped before and regardless from any human intervention. Pragmatism gives up the traditional dichotomy between an independent subject and a merely external reality in favor of an idea of living beings as being integral parts of their environment, depending on it for sustaining their own life, and at the same time contributing to change the environment itself to a larger or lesser degree. Assuming this mutual co-determination between organism and environment does not prevent us to recognize the strong asymmetry between individual or group life and the material conditions in which it takes place, and primarily affecting living organisms as menacing, resistant, or overwhelming. Far from being a mere subjective realm, sensibility manifests itself as a way to reaffirm the reality of our relations with the world, and of the world itself on a level that is not primarily cognitive or epistemic, but is anchored in life material conditions as felt, suffered, or enjoyed. Moreover, the conception of sensibility I derive from the classic pragmatists, Dewey in particular, converges with Giovanna Colombetti's idea of primary affectivity. She conceives primary affectivity as permeating the mind. Consequently, sense-making is conceived as a way of behaving of living organism in an environment according to the meanings that the various aspects of that environment get for their own lives. Affective neuroscientists generally consider emotions and moods as the eminent phenomena to be studied, episodically affecting an otherwise neutral, non-affective mind. On the contrary, her enactive approach converges with Dewey's idea that sensibility is structural for living beings, who are always biased because their own life is always at stake to a greater or lesser extent. Concern, interest, and purpose, as Mead clearly saw, are primarily affective aspects of our conduct, rooted in our dependence from a natural as well as natural social environment. So, the following section is entitled Sensibility for Radical Empiricists. Empirically, says Dewey, we cannot deny that first of all we experience situations as, I quote, arresting and engrossing, end of quote. We feel our surrounding as risky and fearful. We tend to be absorbed by what is happening around us, whether by suffering things and people or enjoying their presence. In Dewey and James's lexicon, probably derived in part from Bain, we tend to experience things aesthetically, that is, not as means for making reference to something else and preparing for further engagement, but as things of direct engagement, enjoyment, and suffering. This is the difference for Dewey between knowing and having or feeling, that is, between considering things and aspects of experience with reference to postponed purposes on the one hand, and things as having a direct impact on our own existence on the other hand. By the way, my hypothesis is that this Deweyan distinction could be seen as an original appropriation and reinterpretation of Peirce's difference between secondness and thirdness. But of course, I will not explore this point today. Empirically, repeats Dewey with an implicit criticism toward the empirical tradition, I quote, the existence of objects of direct grasp, possession, use, and enjoyment cannot be denied. Empirically, things are poignant, tragic, beautiful, humorous, subtle, disturbed, comfortable, annoying, barren, harsh, consoling, splendid, fearful, are such immediately and in their own right and behalf. If we take advantage of the word aesthetic in a wider sense than that of application to the beautiful and the ugly, aesthetic quality, immediate, final, or self-enclosed, indubitably characterize natural situations as they empirically occur. End of quote. From Experience and Nature. The need to recognize the role of gross experience represented a central claim in Dewey's Experience and Nature, matching with James's insistence on the necessity to recognize the richness and vagueness of human experience, as well as the reality of relations whose consistency should not be neglected by taking discrete physical entities as the only standard for being real. For sure, this is part of an anti-intellectualistic stance shared by the two pragmatists. In both cases, however, this kind of claim did not bring them to a refusal of a theoretical attitude. Differently, it pushed them to find a theoretical framework to deal with qualitative, non-primarily cognitive features of human interaction with an environment. In my opinion, Dewey's approach to qualitative, aesthetic, or affective experience that I suggest characterizing as sensibility can be seen as a radicalization of James's scattered attempts in this direction. In turn, I am proposing a further development of Dewey's idea on these issues by formulating a more explicitly non-foundational theory of sensibility as eminently qualitative, aesthetic, or affective. A first crucial point to consider is that from Dewey and Mead's point of view, we should deny that our ordinary experience of things is primarily constituted by a mere descriptive level, assuming purely sensorial data and only later a second layer, consisting in attributing an affective or qualitative meaning, namely an existential value, to them. On the contrary, Dewey suggests the case of sugar as an example. In perceiving something as sweet, I do not firstly register purely descriptive sensorial data and then ascribe to the object a certain quality, as if perception would have basically made of two different steps. The first one mirroring an allegedly objective state of things out there through the senses, and a second one consisting in the projection of a merely subjective value on it, as it is the case, for example, according to Martha Nussbaum's interpretation of emotions, of the emotion. On the contrary, I immediately feel something as sweet, that is, perception is already qualitatively laden, in the sense that what I feel is, in this case, pleasure, namely a positive relation of an aspect of the environment with reference to my own life. For Dewey and the classical pragmatists, perception is already charged with an affectively, qualitatively, or aesthetically oriented proto-evaluation. That is, it is already meaningful with reference to the perceiver's own life. Returning to our example of the overcrowded train wagon, when the body of my neighbor accidentally bumps on my own body, I do not firstly register a neutral tactile impact through the sense of touch and only later attribute a value to the other action on my body. On the contrary, I am immediately annoyed by or pleased with that causal contact that carries on a more or less primitive meaning for my own life. At this point, however, we cannot hide that when choosing to use the old conceptual tool of quality for dealing with sensibility, we have to tackle at least a couple of very serious philosophical problems. The first one regards the conception of functions of qualities in modern philosophy, since the famous modern distinction between primary quality and secondary properties, and the seemingly irrevocable ascription of secondary qualities to the subjective real. Both Jameses and Dewey had this long-standing issue in view and strenuously fought to criticize the empirical tradition on this subject. Synthetically, James' first contribution, in my view, is represented by his arguing in favor of the reality of relations. Empiricism is wrong when it restricts its conception of reality to discrete entities, while ascribing the power to connect the allegedly different minimal components of reality to the mind. Why should we deny that relations are an important part of our world and seclude them inside the human mind? A first important contribution we can derive from Dewey consists in adopting an adverbial conception of qualities, by assuming that they are not specific and consequently very problematic kinds of entity. On the contrary, they are real modes of real relations taking place between organism and their environment, relations that are part of our world and contribute to change it to a more or less extent. Being real is not equivalent to being a res, that is, a thing or a substance, and the way in which organic environmental interactions occur are real, although they should not be hypostatized as states of mind. Furthermore, Dewey's decisive contribution, I argue, consists in his anchoring the reality of qualitative experience on the organic exposition of human life to the environment, that is, on the broadly biological base of the structural dependence of human living beings from the natural and naturally social environment they belong to and are constituted by. Relations of dependence and belongings are real parts of the world. They contribute to modify and reconfigure it continuously and from within. The second issue consists of the risk to indulge in a still foundational theory of sensibility, although not more in an epistemological key. In my opinion, acknowledging that cognition is anchored in life should not push us to endorse a hierarchical, one-way conception of the relations between sensibility and more reflective engagement with the environment. Differently, I think that although primarily felt experience represent the source and the point of arrival of cognitive practices, we should take into serious account the peculiar form of life we are dealing with. The point is that human forms of life are naturally social and naturally characterized by meaningful, linguistic, and normative practices whose results are sedimented and habitualized in our sensibility, which is consequently constantly reshaped by the kind of naturally cultural and social environment we live in. In other words, it is the consequence of the naturally cultural and social character of the human environmental niche that should be taken into account. Even the so-called pre-linguistic baby is fully embedded in this kind of niche since her or his own birth, and even before. Hence, by adopting a coherent conception of cultural naturalism and emergence, I think we should favor a circular view of the relations between sensibility and reflective experience, rather than a linear one, assuming that they mutually shape each other, and consequently human sensibility is not equal to non-human animals' sensibility, at least for the moment. So, in the last part of my paper, I will explore this last issue. I mean the risk that because we assume that meaning is rooted in our bodily, qualitative, affective or aesthetic experience, the relation between sensibility and language should be interpreted as foundational, one-way, and as hierarchically ordered. In my opinion, this kind of suggestion is still present in some phenomenologically oriented perspective. For example, in Merleau-Ponty, who did not completely give up the old Husserlian project of grounding language and new forms of expressions on perception. The idea, very basically, that meaning has its roots in a pre-linguistic bodily perception and is exposed to linguistic and normative practices only later, is still a prevalent paradigm we can find in the work of scholars very attentive to the complexity of human perception, such as, for example, Hubert Dreyfus. An analogous, although not identical, foundational attitude can be found also among supporters of enactivism, who strongly stress the difference between low-order and high-order cognitive practices, for example, Dan Hatto, so that one of the main issues in this field becomes that of filling the alleged gap between, so to speak, first-order and second-order cognitive practices. Also, Mark Johnson's work on the aesthetic in experience seemed to adopt a similar attitude when considering the anchorage of conceptual and linguistic forms of sense-making in radically embodied qualitative and aesthetic experience. His primary argumentative target is the, I quote, conceptual propositional theory of meaning, end of quote, based on the assumption that meaning is exclusively or primarily conceptual or propositional in nature. Differently, he openly endorses an embodied view of meaning, looking for, I quote, the origins and structures of meaning in the organic activities of embodied creatures in interaction with their changing environments, end of quote. However, it is not clear whether he is fighting against a specific conception of language as mainly consisting in proposition and the conveying of concepts, or if he is making reference to an allegedly mere bodily aesthetic level of meaning, which would be precluded to language in general. The second kind of reading is supported by his claims that embodied meanings lie, I quote, beneath words and sentence, end of quote, as well as when he indulges in considering early childhood experience as providing, I quote, a meaningful contact with our world that should be prior to language, end of quote. For sure, James was attracted by the mermaid of vague experience as prior to language, even though there are different ways to interpret his approach to language, as William Gavin rightly pointed out. On the other hand, Dewey was not always completely in the clear from some hesitations. Nonetheless, he explicitly considered human sensibility and qualitative meaning-making as structurally reorganized by the advent of language and linguistic shared practices. This is evident by the choice to reserve the word mental for distinguishing human forms of interaction with an environment from other intelligent, although non-linguistic behaviors characterizing other animals. Amidst words, we must consider that in human forms of life, physiologically based emotive responses to the environment are called for by symbolic stimuli or aesthetic stimuli, as he said in a short abstract entitled A Theory of Emotions from the Physiological Point of View, and not by merely physical features. In my opinion, we should bring some of the classical pragmatist insights to their coherent conclusion by basically working on two sides. On the one hand, we should endorse a more complex image of language as primarily consisting in shared linguistic practices, having hence in view, Dewey speaks of communication as making something common or in common, and being largely ruled by an affectively or qualitative oriented mutual sensibility. Proposition and expressions of allegedly predefined concepts do not exhaust our ordinary experience of language. Verbal utterances are much more similar to a tangle of different practices, functioning for a great part according to a vague or mongrel functionality. This is an expression by Joe Margolis, that is largely based on sensibility, namely on qualitative discriminations. My further efforts will be devoted to the development of a qualitative, richer conception of language conceived as continuous rather than as opposed to sensibility, as I have already told you. On the other hand, we should consider rejecting the idea of a one-way foundation of linguistic and generally higher forms of cognition on sensibility by taking into serious account the linguistic structure of the human environment. I mean not as a kind of quasi-transcendental enabling condition in the way, for example, Appel and more recently McDowell or Brandon have done. I think we should take into account the linguistic structure of the human environment as a completely contingent, although irreversible feature. In other terms, I contend that we should consider the effects of the broadly linguistic structure of our environment on the reshaping of our sensibility in comparison to other moving and sensitive but not speaking forms of animal life. Adopting a general continuistic view on sensibility should not prevent us to question about the specificity of human sensibility in comparison to other animal sensibilities. We are linguistic bodies, as very recently Di Paolo, Cuffari, and De Jager had written in their book 2018. That is, our bodily constitution is not forged apart or prior to the fact we live in a broadly speaking linguistic environment, and consequently we are selectively oriented to feel not just the physical words, but culturally configure things, events, and individuals as attractive, disgusting, or even as simply uninteresting for us. Our more or less stronger affectively laden bodily impulsions and reactions are embedded in a broader linguistic context of practices that are already unfolding before our most intimate perception of ourselves take place. There is also a further reason to claiming that human sensibility is not independent of cultural and linguistic forms of sharing a common, for better or worse, of course, environment, namely a coherent conception of cultural naturalism and emergence. From a pragmatist view, the notion of emergence involves more than the assumption that new forms of organization are irreducible to the single features they are composed of, even though no external force played a role in letting them arise. Emergence embroils also the idea that new forms of interaction between already existing natural elements retroact or have a loop effect on previous modes of behaving, because the rising of a new form of organization of the relationships between living organisms and their environments becomes a part of the environment and modifies it from within. Consequently, living beings have to tackle a different environment, so that both of them, organism as well as their environment, are mutually reshaping each other, of course at different extent and times, although constantly and irreversibly. The introduction of a new form of interaction of organism-environment relations in a pre-given structure can play a disruptive, although fortuitous and completely contingent role that does not leave the previous existent order unchanged. From this perspective, it becomes clear why both Dewey and Mead consider the advent of a linguistic form of communication and meaning-making as crucial to the emergence of the mind, considered as a novel kind of interaction taking place among human animals. My further target at this point will consist in trying to figure out which feedback consequences or loop effects could have impinged on a peculiar human sensibility, given the cultural linguistic niche we happen to live in and we contributed to forging at different time scales. In other words, the issue will be considering the changes and reconfiguration undergone by animal sensibility in the human cultural linguistic form of life. However, it's time to end and not take advantage anymore of your passion. So, thank you very much.
I like your decision to reconstruct the word sensibility. It's hardly ever used in English anymore, and as a result of that, it has a sort of an open field of meaning. But historically, it meant what we now mean by sentiment. And it may be far enough past that meaning, which was 18th and 19th century, that now you don't have to worry that people will hear the word sensibility and think, oh, she's talking about sentiment. But that does remind me that in the 18th century, the British philosophers, in particular the Scottish philosophers such as Hume and Hutchinson and Reid, used the word sentiment in very much the way you are using the word sensibility. And I wonder what connection you see between the classical empirical condition in the sense of Scottish moral sense theory. We're not talking about Locke's empiricism, but I'm speaking more of Scottish Enlightenment empiricism, which, as you know, also connects rather intimately with Peirce and your reconstruction of the word sensibility. And I have a second question that I just want to ask now, and if you don't want to answer it, it's fine. But a number of the people that you cite in the cognitive literature, particularly Gallagher, make a very big deal out of the idea of person. You would also, I don't remember whether Hutto does, but I know that Ellis and Newton do. And the idea, and Panksepp as well, they make a big deal out of the idea of person. I'd very much like to hear what person. I'd very much like to hear where person fits in with what you're doing, and because actually James and Peirce make a big deal of this as well.
So, two big questions. So, to the first issue you mentioned, I think that not only in the tradition you are mentioning, there was a large convergence, an idea of sensibility as having to do with sentiment. I think that something similar happened also in Kant, not in the first critique, but in the third critique.
Yeah.
Gefühl is sentiment, is the capacity to feel themselves as we are related to a representation of the object. So I think that there are many historical roots and justification for using again this kind of word. I think that the main difference by my relying on pragmatist resources is that the approach is much more holistic, while in all the different traditions we mentioned, the Scottish common sensists, the empiricists in the sense of Locke, the Kantian, the point of departure is an analytic one, and the problem is always that of how can we put together all this different stuff. About Gallagher and Peirce. So I am conscious that Peirce did a lot of work in this sense. I am originally a Deweyan scholar, and I tried to work on James and on Mead in order to point out a continuity, a basic continuity among their works. I think that there is also a deep continuity with some of Peirce's intuition.
I was actually asking about the idea of person.
Oh, person.
Person.
Oh, excuse me.
Yeah. Peirce hooks up with the
Okay.
sensus communis tradition, but
Okay.
person. Yeah.
So to end with Peirce, I have not. I think that this should be a cooperative work. That is, scholars of Peirce should integrate this kind of approach. Regarding person, really, do you think that person is a big?
It's a big deal for Gallagher and Ellis and Newton and Panksepp and the inactivists that you quote. They're all personalists.
You say so.
I know so. I know them all.
I'm not sure of this. I'm not sure of this.
Oh, I'll put
Could
you in touch with them.
Okay.
Yeah.
Gallagher is going to come to Venice next
You asked
September.
him. You asked him.
Okay.
All right.
So could you maybe give me some more elements in order to understand in which sense you say that person, the concept of person, is important for them?
Yeah, we could talk about it later, but I was just curious as to whether, since it's a big deal for them, and in activism, you really have two kinds. There's the impersonalist and the personalist, and everybody you quoted is a personalist, and so I'm interested in it. But we can talk about it some other time.
Okay.
I'll take the opportunity. Could you say more about how you characterize this pre-linguistic sense of meaning that is already part of what you're describing as sensibility?
So, I think that in the human case, we should not speak about a pre-linguistic conception of meaning. I do not exclude that there could be meaningful interaction between animal forms and their own environment. But in the case of a human being, the point to be considered to me is the fact that we are already embedded in a linguistic niche. And this makes a difference, because if we consider that the word is not an already equipped, completely defined per se external reality, but is something that is dynamically configuring itself, and that we are a part, maybe a a minor one, but we are a part, an ingredient of this change. We cannot speak about a kind of primordial, original approach to meaning that is not affected by our linguistic practice. For example, the infant is, since his her very first days, embedded in a kind of communication, of interactions that is immediately significant, of course not on a referential level, but on a emotive level. I think that Mead and Dewey were able to see this kind of a feature of our experience many years before, for example, Trevarten or people like him. And so I see no space for a meaning that is prior to commonly shared linguistic practices in the human case.
What about non-linguistic?
Yes, of course, we have also non-linguistic practice. I would not assume a dogmatic conception of language. I would assume a very broad conception of language, including cultural practices, symbolic practices, gestural ones. What is the difference is, I think, the contrast is between an idea of the human engagement and other form of sociality. For example, in The Public and Its Problems, Dewey says there is nothing spatial to say about sociality. Many other kind of animals are social. The point is that we are social in a different way. And why are we social in a different way? Why can we take the role of the other, to use the expression by Mead? I think that it is because we are entangled from from our birth on in this net of relations.
I'm not sure if you'll be able to answer my question, but in the last several months, I've been exploring ancient cosmology. And the question that has kind of been needling me is the expression of language through hieroglyphics, through even the construction of monumental architecture and these ancient monuments that transcend time. If there's anything that you came across in this realm of language that sparks any kind of originary kind of thing that would cross cultural lines.
Could you add some more elements so I can understand better what you are...
Oh, okay, yes. So in Egyptian hieroglyphs, we have one version that is the broadly accepted Rosetta Stone type of crossover, where the pictorial representation is that of letters, right? And sounds that would make up words. And then there's also in the Mayan, the Chinese, all these different cultures of the ancient world, also have a pictorial representation, which is much more rich and has more of a, what I would say, linguistic depth that is more rich than just, say, the vulgar use of, the script.
Marks and noises.
Yes.
It's more than marks and noises.
Yes, it's more than marks and noises.
It's more than royalty.
Yeah, there's an aesthetic quality,
Of
right?
course.
Yeah.
I have to think about that. It is a subject I do not consider. I think that there are. I'm open in the sense that there are many ways we use symbols and we get rid of them. I can perceive, but maybe I'm wrong, a kind of dissatisfaction for alphabetic kind of script, of writing on your side. I would be more liberal. That is, there are. It depends on the use we make of different forms of writing. There can be alphabetic forms of writing that are impoverishing, and there are alphabetic forms of writing that can be enriching. And the same can be said about pictorial form of writings.
Well, sure.
Representation is not a guarantee. But I have nothing more specific to say about that. I'm sorry.
Okay, thank you. Yeah.
I wanted to ask the question from the discipline of anthropology point of view, and I realize that American anthropology and European anthropology is structured completely differently in Europe versus America. You integrate a number of philosophical perspectives in your question of this relationship between language and symbolism and the development at a very young age, where you reach beyond your philosophical discipline to neurobiology, and you mentioned Mead, which I didn't quite hear if that was Margaret Mead or...
No. George Herbert
George
Mead.
Herbert.
Okay, then I misunderstood, but nevertheless,
The name
I'm
is-
wondering if you are willing to reach out to neurobiology. Have you examined an American primatologist, or the interface between American primatologists, paleontologists, and early archaeological, paleontological nexus, trying to interpret some of these same origins of language and symbolism and the interplay with culture in human nature, that it has some kind of synergy that even after many decades of examination, people are finding new information.
So, of course, there is an interest for anthropology. My idea is to try to articulate a kind of pragmatist anthropology, but it is, of course, a philosophical anthropology. So, I think that from a strictly anthropological point of view, my kind of approach would be too generalized one. It would sound as a too generalized one. Nonetheless, I think that we have to do this kind of job, and I think that, and widely relaying on the kind of results you are mentioning, that is archaeological, evolutionary archaeological results, studies on the genesis of language in evolutionary developmental psychology and so on and so forth. I think that in this sense I'm not innovating the pragmatist traditions, because if you give a look at Dewey's experience and nature bibliography. Most of it is constituted by anthropologists such as Boas. I think that there are passages of the mind of a primitive man that are very similar to passages of art experience. There are Dewey mention Goldenweiser, who was one of Boas' former students. There is a wonderful, to me, quotation of Malinowski in the book, the essay collected in the book The Meaning of Meaning by Ogden and Richards, in a note to the chapter of Experience and Nature on language, basically underlying a convergence with Dewey's own position. So I think that this is a kind of trend in pragmatism. I mean the trend consisting in being very open and very attentive to the results that can be derived from anthropology, evolutionary biology, developmental psychology, and so on and so forth, and philosophy. But as I told you, I'm not original in this sense. I think that this kind of attitude deserves attention and should be pursued.
So I wanted to talk about the crowded train. But here's my question, and then I'll talk about the crowded train rather than just work up to it. My question is, do you think there's a qualitative layer of immediate experience that is not reducible to sensibility as you understand it in these?
I think so.
Okay, yeah, and then how does that fit in then with your discussion of sensibility understood in terms of these biological, cultural conceptualizations, and so the crowded train? I can sympathize with being annoyed on a crowded city train. You live in Venice, I lived in New York City for a while, and I certainly felt a danger and a displeasure at various smells and threats while sitting on these trains in the city. But I also, when I was thinking clearly from an aesthetic point of view, was in touch with a kind of irreducible felt element that was a kind of excitement, energy that was not reducible to my interest or a certain end towards which I was heading, getting to work safely, something like that. So how does that idea of a kind of non-reducible qualitative layer of experience fit in with your discussion of sensibility?
So I think that the idea of considering sensibility as something that is both biologically and culturally anchored should not prevent us to consider that there are also experiences that are strictly private. That is, I have no problem in maintaining a certain kind of distinction. Of course, it depends on the circumstances. That is, in certain circumstances, we can make distinction, and there are elements of our experience that are idiosyncratic. But I think that the wrong point should be that of assuming this kind of aspect as paradigmatic to understand all of our sensibility. This is the first answer. A second part of my answer about the felt quality, I would know something more from you. That is, do you think that this felt quality, could you depict this felt quality as ineffable? Are you thinking to this kind of
Well,
characterization, or
it's versus firstness. So it's ineffable, he says, when we try to describe it, you know, it flees immediately. But it's still there. It's a layer of our experience of
yes,
phenomena.
okay.
And it's something we can prescind, to use his language, and discuss, and artists and poets can express quite elegantly to us. So it's not something that's ungraspable, you know, even though we can't put it in a kind of, you know, propositional form or something like that. Yeah, so it's elusive, but it's important, and I think it's where a pragmatist, maybe not a pragmatist, would start from in order to discuss human sensibility.
So maybe my presentation could have given the impression that I think that sensibility is always functional to us. But this would be a misunderstanding, because two of the verbs usually suggested by Dewey in speaking about the quality of a situation is that it is being overwhelmed or absorbed by the quality of what is surrounding us. That is, there is a relation, but this relation has not inevitably to be guided by us. Very often what we experience is the impact of the situation on us, and we have no possibility to rule it, to guide it. Notwithstanding, in spite of this, there's a relation. The relation goes from the overwhelming situation to us, but there's a relation. So, if you adopt a Persian lexicon, I would say that the firstness shows itself as articulating a kind of secondness, but this secondness has an effective aesthetic quality, dimension.
You can talk more.
From the point of view of the aesthetic issue, I think that, of course, a painter or a writer strongly rely on this kind of thickness, let's say this way. But a poet or a painter is not only a man of firstness and secondness. He is always already also a man of thirdness, in the sense that for producing a good work of art, the poet or the painter has to re-elaborate this kind of experience through his own tools. And so an aesthetic experience is not simply, from an artistic experience, is not simply an impact. It is something more
Yeah, I would use
articulated.
the language of impact or secondness, which sounds like that's ruling Dewey's discussion of this split and this, you know, with the environment, suppressiveness, you know, these kind of words stand out to me as boiling down the richness of pure experience to pleasurable or painful or striking or not striking, and it's just, I think it's more rich than that pure experience.
this is a point. I ended my presentation by making reference to a further part of my research. And this further part of my research concerned the way in which a culturally rich environment can retroact and have a feedback effect on sensibility. And I think that one of the main effects consists exactly in this kind of emerging, let's say, of a complex web of nuances. I think that both Dewey and James derived their idea of the aesthetic from Bain and from his conception of perception as fundamentally based on pain or pleasure. I'm not sure that for mamas this works. Maybe also for many kind of mamas it doesn't. But at least for men, this is a too dichotomic, too simplistic alternative. We do not suffer or enjoy the world simply. We have a much more, a much richer, complex variety of possibilities. And I think that this is a quantitative difference from the point of view of human sensibility in comparison with animal, the non-human animal sensibility, that is largely connected, that should be largely connected with our linguistic, cultural practices that are exposed to many alternatives that are not open to other kinds of animals.
Sounds like a person to me. So even the most macho abstract expressionists, Jackson Pollock, or Barnett Newman, or Robert Motherwell, turns out there's thirdness, in spite of it. In spite of what they're doing, there's thirdness. Because after all, it's the work of a person. Which is almost what you just said. It's not open to other forms of life, right?
So
you said
you know
non-human
that
animals, right?
You know that very often beyond the dripping of Jackson Pollock, there were representation of figures.
Yeah, sure.
And they were re-elaborated by Pollock. Of course, it is a very strange kind of re-elaboration, but there is an elaboration.
Well, it's a reduction almost back to firstness and secondness in interaction, but you can't leave out that there's an idea there that's operative, and it's highly mediated, and it's driven not only by concept but by the meaning of the concept, and so you couldn't toss that out of the aesthetics no matter how hard you tried, so long as it was a human production, I would say, or the production of a person. I mean, maybe elephants could do that too with their pain, but I said,
They do. I have one.
There you go. That's it. I don't want to just say human, but the point is there might be elephant persons and whatnot. But whatever it is, that reduction from thirdness back to the interplay of secondness and firstness that you would find in abstract expressionism is a reduction that can only be undertaken given a whole range of meaning.
So maybe I have not an answer, but the beginning of an answer to your questioning about persons. That is, I think that one of the effects of the feedback action of our widely linguistic, cultural, environmental niche on sensibility is represented by this wide variety of nuances that are at our disposal, or to which we are, to whose disposal we are. It can be also this way. Another important feedback effect is represented by the fact that by speaking, by listening, hearing to my own voice as I'm answering you now, my sensibility can turn on my own person. And so there is a kind of meta sensibility directed on me that is rising. And this opens the way to a conception of self-awareness as not primarily epistemic phenomenon, but as a kind of sensitive-based.
Yeah, that's what I was pushing for. Yeah.
So while we speak about interiority and elephant, for them, at least for them, I'm open. Maybe they will be able, but at least for the moment, they can't speak about their own interiority. So also the discourse on inner private speech is not to be completely abandoned. It is to be reframed to me. This is my idea. Have I begun?
Yeah, we're getting somewhere. Larry, surely you have a question or an observation.
I'm enjoying it.
Okay.
I did have,
Yes!
there is some place where Dewey talks, and I can't remember the exact place, talks about impulsions and impulses. And I'm wondering how,
In Arta's experience.
if at all that fits into what you're doing. And I'm thinking also tying that into the reflex arc
Yes, of course.
article. There's got to be some connection here to what you're doing, but I can't quite get it.
There was also a section of my, in the original draft of the chapter, there is also a section devoted to this point. And I definitely think that there is a deep continuity between the essay on the reflect art concept and art as expression. The distinction between impulse and impulsion is at the beginning of the chapter on the act of expression. And Dewey is basically, to me, recovering his idea of impulsion as organic circuit. That is, every human action is not should not be considered as the point zero of a linear behavior, but as deriving from a propensity of the organism already exposed to and so and so on. So I think 30 years, 35 years passed from the essay on the organic circuit to art experience, but I think that Dewey basically maintained this idea. I think that the use that the enactivists are doing of this essay is, on the one hand, a good one, on the other hand, a limited one. Alvanoe, is he a personalist too?
Who?
Alvanoe, you know?
I don't know that.
No, you don't know.
Probably not then.
So Alvanoe wrote Action in Perception, and he strongly emphasized the idea that that perception involves already involves a form of action. It is the old idea expressed by Merleau-Ponty, Wahrnehmen ist sich bewegen.
Everybody's rediscovering what we already knew 100
Yes,
years ago.
it is. I think that this is a good point, in the sense that it helps us rediscovering a more complex idea of perception as not consisting in a mirroring of what is out there, simply mirroring what is out there. Nevertheless, it is just a part of perception. And so in that sense, I think that we as pragmatists can I say, teach them something more complex. That is perception, movement, but why are we moved? Being moved is being sensible in the affective sense. And so I think that we have still something to do to this kind of people.
Well, that distinction may also have to do with autonomic responses and interest.
With
Autonomic responses and interests. I had a teacher in graduate school who was a student of Mead's, George Herbert Mead's, and he was fond of saying most of our thinking is from here down. So maybe there's something here in that division between the autonomic response and interest. I think Dewey's example is of a lion who is asleep, and there's a smell that doesn't wake him up, but his nose twitches, something like that. That's an autonomic response. But in terms of the impulse, there's an antelope in the neighborhood, and that's definitely an interest, right? So I think there may be some way to move on that in that direction.
I think so. The point to me is that by adopting a pragmatist stance, we can avoid the dichotomy between an idea of voluntary action as beginning ex nihilo and an idea of total determinism. That is, we are, let's say, moderately or free. Our liberty, our freedom begins in the middle of the road, not from the beginning of the road.
Thank you.
You touched on something that I want to ask about. Early on, you used the words progressive neuroscience, and this is all in that context. Expand on it. Expand on what you mean by progressive neuroscience.
By progressive neuroscience, I mean neuroscientists who are not so heavily brain-centered. That is, that do not assume that everything is calculated, computed within the brain, but at least the body has a very important structural function, and also the environment. So this is one point. Another point characterizing, let's say, more progressive neurosciences than traditional one, Dennett, for example, or philosophy of mind, it would be better to speak about philosophies of mind, is that they are not or non-primarily representational. That is, they do not assume that cognition means a kind of reflective mirroring or the outward, the reality out there, or that cognition would consist in computing mental representation, but consists in an active engagement with the world around us. I think that we should recognize that there are significant movements, and this in current neurosciences and in the philosophy of mind, that maybe can also help us in refining our philosophical tools, because they oblige us to detail in a more refined way the position we traditionally have.
A closer look at the construction of an internal construct,
Of it?
of an internal construct,
Yes.
not a reflection of whatever.
Of course. I think so.
Dave?
Well, at this point, I'm
One
beginning.
more.
At
So be the
this
last
point-
one.
At this point, I'm beginning to lose grasp of what your complaints against the neo-pragmatists were. Because it sounds like that's what they're doing is,
I understand what you are saying. For example, there are, of course, you know the so-called Dreyfus-McDowell debate on. I think that I'm not sure that McDowell is such a simple-minded person as Dreyfus characterize him or depict. However, I think that the idea of language as quasi-transcendental condition is not faithful to the pragmatist heritage, in the sense that from a pragmatist point of view, from a classical pragmatist point of view, our becoming linguistic beings has a history, a natural history. We could have a different natural history. It is fortuitous, but as I told some minutes ago, it is irreversible. In the measure, to the extent to which it is irreversible, we have to take it into account. But this does not mean that language is a kind of quasi-transcendental condition of our sensibility. I think that this is a kind of Kantian operation, Kantian strategy that is profoundly foreign to classical pragmatism. What do you think about that?
I think it's more than Kantian, I think it's Hegelian. But what Roberta is saying, and probably almost everybody in the room except Dave would buy, he was Brandon's student, many years ago, however, and has grown beyond it, but is, as what Roberta is saying is these guys aren't naturalists. Not really. And almost everybody in this room is going to nod when I say that those guys are not naturalists.
No,
Quasi-transcendental
not at all.
conditions, my eye. But anyway, thank you, Roberta, and thank you, Ken, and thank you, Dave, and everybody who asked questions and everybody who showed up. Don't hurry away. There's guacamole. I made it myself. There's plenty of wine. There's beer in the refrigerator, and there's no hurry. And there's more coffee for those of you who have had enough or don't partake. So thank you so much.
Thank you very much.